The small wooden church of Red Rock stood alone on the open prairie like a tombstone aimed at the sky. It was a stark, whitewashed structure that had been battered gray by years of relentless wind and grit. There were no trees to break the gusts that came sweeping down from the north, only miles of buffalo grass and sagebrush that hissed endlessly against the rough-hewn siding. The building seemed to cling to the earth with a desperate sort of tenacity, its steeple slightly crooked, pointing toward a heaven that felt very far away on this particular Tuesday in November. Dust was the true owner of this land. It coated the windows of the church in a fine, brown film, turning the mid-morning sunlight into a dull, suffocating haze inside the sanctuary. Outside, the horizon was broken only by the distant, dark shapes of grazing cattle, moving like slow ink stains across the ridges. The wind howled around the corners of the eaves, a low and mournful sound that rattled the window panes in their frames, drowning out the nervous coughing of the congregation gathered inside. It was not a day for a celebration. It was a day for endurance. Inside, the air was stagnant and smelled of old hymnals, beeswax, and the damp wool of Sunday coats. Clara stood at the altar, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned the color of new milk. She wore a wedding dress that had belonged to her mother, the lace at the cuffs yellowed with age and smelling faintly of lavender and camphor. But it felt less like a garment and more like a shroud. The fabric was stiff, scratching at her neck, trapping the heat of her body and the cold sweat that trickled down her spine. She could feel the roughness of the wooden floorboards through the thin soles of her shoes. One board near the toe of her left boot was warped, rising slightly above the others, and she focused on it with a singular, desperate intensity. If she looked at the floor, she did not have to look at the man standing beside her. If she looked at the floor, she did not have to see the faces of the townspeople sitting in the pews behind her, their eyes boring into her back like nails. Silas Ward stood to her right. He was a pillar of the territory, a man whose name was painted in gold letters on the window of the only bank in the county and burned into the hides of 3,000 head of cattle. He was 50 years old, nearly 30 years Clara's senior, with silver hair smoothed back with pomade and a face that seemed carved from cold tallow. He smelled of expensive tobacco and bay rum, a scent that made Clara's stomach knot with a nausea she had been fighting since dawn. Silas shifted his weight, the floorboards groaning under his expensive leather boots. He reached out and covered her clasped hands with his own. His palm was dry and cool, his fingers heavy. Clara flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a tiny jerk of her wrist, but Silas felt it. He did not pull away. Instead, his grip tightened, his thumb pressing hard against the delicate bones of her hand. A silent warning masked as a lover's touch. She risked a glance upward. Silas was looking at the preacher, but a thin, possessive smile played on his lips. It was the smile of a man who had just signed a deed for a prime piece of grazing land at a price far below its value. He did not look at her with affection. He looked at her with the satisfaction of ownership. Clara felt the air in her lungs turn to stone. This was not a marriage. It was an acquisition. From the front pew, a throat cleared. The sound was sharp, reprimanding. Clara did not need to turn her head to know it was Ethan, her stepfather. She could picture him perfectly, his jaw set like granite, his Sunday suit brushed free of the dust that usually coated him, his eyes hard and unyielding. Ethan was a man who believed in survival above all else, and he viewed sentimentality as a weakness that led to starvation. Earlier that morning, in the kitchen of their failing homestead, Ethan had laid out the reality of her life with brutal efficiency. He had stood by the wood stove, pouring black coffee, and told her that the note on the ranch was due at the end of the month. He told her that the wells were running dry and the winter feed was gone. He told her that Silas Ward had graciously offered to absolve the debts, to fund the new irrigation, and to ensure that Clara's mother did not die in a poorhouse, provided Clara accepted his proposal. "It is your duty," Ethan had said, his voice flat. "You are the only thing of value we have left to trade." Clara remembered the way the kitchen light had caught the dust motes dancing in the air, mocking her. She remembered thinking of running, of taking the mare and riding west until the horse dropped. But there was nowhere to go. The territory was vast, but for a woman without money or protection, it was a prison without walls, and so she had put on the yellowing dress. She had walked into the church. She had walked to the slaughter. Reverend Miller opened his Bible, the pages rustling loudly in the quiet church. He was a thin, nervous man who owed Silas Ward money for the parsonage roof, and his voice trembled slightly as he began the service. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend intoned, his voice echoing off the bare walls. "We are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Clara closed her eyes. The darkness behind her lids was a relief. The Reverend's voice became a drone, a distant buzzing fly. In the dark, she was not here. She was 5 years in the past. She was standing by the south fence line of her family's property, back when the creek still ran deep and cold. The sun was hot on her shoulders, and the smell of sweetgrass was thick in the air. She was not alone in the memory. He was there, Jacob Holloway. Jace. He had been 19 then, lean and dangerous even before he had grown into the man the territory feared. He had been a drifter, hired on to break horses and mend fences, with nothing to his name but a saddle, a fast gun, and a smile that could stop Clara's heart in her chest. He had wild dark hair and eyes the color of flint, and he looked at her in a way that made her feel seen, truly seen, not as a daughter or a chore or a fierce responsibility, but as Clara. They had met in the long shadows of the evenings, sharing water from a tin canteen, talking about the world beyond the ridge. He had told her he was going to build something of his own one day. He had told her he would come back for her when he had enough money to buy land that no one could take away. "I will come for you, Clara," he had promised, his voice rough with the intensity of first love. "You wait for me, I swear it on my life." But then the fires had started, the range wars, the cattle syndicate, led by men like Silas, had begun squeezing the smaller operations. Jace had been drawn into the violence. There were rumors of gunfights, of stolen horses, of blood spilled in a canyon 3 days' ride to the south, and then silence. He had vanished. Some said he was dead. Some said he had turned outlaw. Clara had waited by the fence line for a year, then 2, until the hope had withered inside her like the grass in the drought. Then came the hard years. Her brother, Caleb, had died in a riding accident that everyone knew was no accident, a cinch strap cut, a spooked horse, a convenient tragedy that left Ethan without an heir and the ranch without a defender. Clara had buried her heart in the grave next to Caleb's and learned to survive. "Do you, Silas Jebediah Ward, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The Reverend's voice cut through her memory, dragging her back to the cold church. "I do," Silas said. His voice was deep, resonant, echoing with absolute certainty. "And do you, Clara Elizabeth Miller?" Clara opened her eyes. The dust motes were still there, suspended in the stagnant air. She felt a scream building in her throat, a wild, feral thing that wanted to tear through the lace and the silence. She looked at the warped floorboard. She thought of her mother's tired face. She thought of the debt. She thought of the emptiness of the prairie. "Take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The silence stretched. It became heavy, oppressive. Someone in the back pew coughed. Silas's hand tightened on hers, painful now, crushing her fingers together. "Say it," he whispered, his lips barely moving, the smile never leaving his face. Clara took a breath. It tasted of dust and despair. Her lips parted. The sound that shattered the silence did not come from her. Crash! The double doors at the back of the church did not just open. They were slammed inward with a violence that shook the entire building. The heavy oak banged against the inner walls like a thunderclap. The wind, kept at bay for the last hour, roared into the sanctuary, bringing with it a swirling cloud of grit, dead leaves, and the biting chill of the coming storm. The congregation gasped as one. twisting in their pews, bonnets turned, coats rustled, and the Reverend stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. Silas stiffened beside her, his grip on her hand turning into a vice, framed in the open doorway, backlit by the harsh, white light of the prairie day. Stood a man. He was tall, his silhouette broad-shouldered and imposing. He wore a long, dust-coated duster that flapped wildly in the wind around his legs. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, the brim battered and stained with sweat and rain. A gun belt was slung low on his hips, the leather worn dark, the handle of a heavy Colt revolver protruding ominously. He stepped inside, and the heavy thud of his boots on the floorboards silenced the wind. He walked out of the blinding light and into the dimness of the nave, and a ripple of recognition and fear went through the room like an electric current. "It is him," a woman whispered loudly from the third row. "Lord have mercy, it is him. Holloway," a man muttered, the name sounding like a curse. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Her knees went watery, and if Silas had not been gripping her so tightly, she would have fallen. It was Jace, but it was not the boy who had kissed her by the creek. This was a man forged in iron and blood. His face was leaner, harder, etched with lines of exhaustion and ruthlessness that had not been there 5 years ago. A jagged white scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. His skin was burned dark by the sun, and his eyes were terrifying. They swept over the crowd with a predator's indifference, dismissing the bankers, the ranchers, the farmers, and the hired guns as if they were nothing more than scenery. He did not look at the Reverend. He did not look at Silas. He looked straight at Clara. The connection was immediate and physical. A blow to the chest. Clara stopped breathing. All the years of waiting, of grieving, of burying him in her mind, evaporated in a single second. He was alive. He was here. And he looked like he had ridden out of hell itself. Silas released Clara's hand and stepped forward, placing his body partially in front of hers. It was a gesture of ownership, not protection. "Now see here," Silas boomed, his voice trying to reclaim the authority of the room. "This is a private ceremony. Holloway, you have no business here. Get out before I have the sheriff arrest you for disturbing the peace." Ethan jumped up from the front pew, his face red with outrage. "You get out of here, you trash! We heard you were dead, and we wished it were true." Jace did not even blink. He did not slow his pace. He strode down the center aisle, his spurs jingling with a cold, metallic rhythm. Chink, chink, chink. The congregation shrank back as he passed, pulling their skirts and coats away from him as if he were diseased. The rumor was that Jace Holloway now owned half the territory north of the river, that he had built his own empire with stolen cattle and hired killers, that he had hung 3 men himself for crossing his line. He stopped 5 feet from the altar. The smell of him hit Clara. Rain, horse sweat, leather, and ozone. It was the smell of the storm. Jace ignored Ethan. He ignored the Reverend, who was clutching his Bible like a shield. He looked at Silas Ward with a gaze of such pure, cold hatred that the banker actually took a half-step back. Then Jace looked at Clara. The hardness in his face fractured, just for a second, revealing a depth of pain and longing that made her heart stutter. "She is mine," Jace said. His voice was not a shout. It was low, rough, like gravel grinding together, but it carried to every corner of the silent church. It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact, as absolute as the ground beneath their feet. The words hung in the air, shocking in their nakedness. In a world of contracts, dowries, and arrangements, he was speaking of something primal. He was not claiming her property rights. He was claiming her soul. Clara felt dizzy. A flush of heat rushed up her neck, a mix of humiliation, to be haggled over like a prize heifer in front of the whole town, and a sudden, dangerous surge of hope that terrified her. "She is mine," Jace repeated, taking another step forward. "I told you I would come back." Silas's face turned a violent shade of purple. He grabbed Clara's arm again, his fingers digging into her bicep hard enough to bruise. "She is my betrothed," Silas shouted, spitting the words. She is marrying me. You are a criminal. Holloway, a thief and a murderer. Sheriff, do your duty." The town sheriff, a heavy-set man named Miller, who sat in the fourth row, stood up hesitantly, his hand hovering near his gun. "Now, Jace, let us not have any trouble in the house of God." Jace's hand moved. It was a blur of motion, too fast to track. He did not draw his gun, but he rested his hand on the grip. A clear and deadly promise. The sheriff froze, sitting back down slowly. Jace looked at Clara. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a rasp. "Do not do this. Do not marry him. Come with me." Clara tried to speak. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed, caught between the crushing weight of her duty to her family and the wild, impossible promise standing before her. She looked at Ethan, whose eyes were filled with fury. She looked at Silas, whose face was twisted with possession. And then she looked at Jace, whose hand was outstretched, calloused and dirty, waiting. Clara stammered. "I cannot. She is staying right here," Silas roared. He yanked Clara backward, pulling her off balance so she stumbled against him. That single motion, the violence of it, the disrespect of it, snapped the tension in the room like a dry twig. Jace moved. He lunged forward, closing the gap between them in a single stride. Silas tried to shove Clara behind him and reach for the small pistol he kept in his coat pocket. But he was a banker, not a fighter. Jace's left hand shot out and clamped around Silas's throat, driving him backward. At the same time, Jace's right hand grabbed Clara's wrist. "Let her go," Jace snarled, shoving Silas hard. Silas stumbled back against the altar rail, knocking over a vase of dried flowers. He gasped for air, his face turning red. Jace pulled Clara toward him. She collided with his chest, the hard buttons of his coat pressing against her cheek. The world spun. "No!" Ethan shouted, rushing forward. "You cannot take her." Jace spun, placing his body between Clara and the approaching men. He did not draw his weapon, but the look on his face stopped Ethan cold. "I am taking her," Jace announced to the room. "And if any man follows us, he had better be ready to die today." Clara found her voice. "Jace, stop! You cannot just... I am saving you! Clara!" Jace shouted back at her, his voice cracking with desperation. Before she could argue, before she could plant her feet, Jace bent his knees and drove his shoulder into her midsection. Clara gasped as the breath was knocked out of her. He swept her legs out from under her and threw her over his shoulder as if she were a sack of grain. "Put me down!" Clara screamed, hitting his back with her fists. "Jace, put me down this instant!" Jace ignored her. He turned and marched back down the aisle. The church erupted into chaos. Women screamed. Men shouted. Silas was scrambling to his feet, yelling for a gun. "Stop him! Shoot him!" Silas shrieked. Jace strode through the doors and back into the biting wind. The light outside was strange now, bruised and purple with the approaching storm. His horse, a massive black stallion that looked as mean as its rider, was tethered loosely to the hitching rail, dancing nervously in the wind. Jace reached the horse and practically threw Clara upward. She scrambled, grasping for the saddle horn, her heavy skirts tangling around her legs. She managed to straddle the animal, the lace of her dress tearing audibly. Jace vaulted up behind her in a fluid motion. He reached around her, grabbing the reins, his arms caging her in. His chest was pressed against her back, radiating heat. "Hold on!" he shouted in her ear. Bang! A gunshot cracked from the church doorway. A bullet whined past them, kicking up a spray of dirt 5 feet to their left. Clara screamed and ducked her head. Jace cursed, a sharp, violent word against her ear. He kicked the stallion hard in the ribs. Hya! The horse surged forward, launching into a gallop instantly. The power of the animal was terrifying. Clara was thrown back against Jace, her hands white-knuckled on the saddle horn. More shots rang out, pop, 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 sounding like firecrackers in the wind. She heard Silas screaming her name, his voice distorted by rage and distance. Jace did not shoot back. He leaned low over the horse's neck, urging it faster. They tore through the main street of Red Rock, scattering chickens and sending a wagon driver hauling on his reins to avoid a collision. The town blurred past. The general store, the saloon, the bank with Silas's name on it, all of it vanishing into the dust. Within seconds, they were clear of the buildings and tearing out onto the open prairie. The wind hit them with full force now, tearing at Clara's veil until it ripped free and went tumbling away into the sagebrush like a white tumbleweed. They rode hard. The galloping of the horse thundered up through Clara's body, jarring her teeth. The dust stung her face, and the wind roared so loudly it drowned out her own thoughts. She felt a profound, terrifying dislocation. 10 minutes ago, she had been a woman about to be married. Now she was a captive, flying across the plains with a man who was supposed to be a memory. She twisted in the saddle, trying to look at Jace, but his hat brim was pulled low, shielding his face. "Where are you taking me?" she screamed over the wind. "Take me back! They will kill you! Jace, they will hang you!" Jace did not slow down. He steered the horse off the main road, cutting sharply toward the broken lands to the west, where the canyons cut deep scars into the earth. "Let them try!" Jace shouted back, his voice swallowed by the gale. "I am not letting him touch you, Clara. I am not letting him destroy you like he did the others." "What others?" Clara cried, tears of wind and fear streaming down her face. "What are you talking about? You have ruined everything." Jace didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on the reins and drove the horse harder, racing the black clouds that were piling up on the horizon, heavy with rain and violence. Clara looked back one last time. The town of Red Rock was just a smudge against the gray sky, and the church steeple was a tiny, white needle pricking the gloom. Then the first drop of icy rain hit her face, and they disappeared into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the west. This was not the end. Clara knew, with a sinking dread in her stomach, that this was only the beginning. The sky did not darken gradually. It collapsed. One moment the prairie was a vast, bruised expanse of purple and gray, and the next it was swallowed by a wall of charcoal clouds that rolled in from the north with the speed of a stampede. The temperature plummeted, stripping the heat from the air so fast that the sagebrush seemed to shiver in the sudden vacuum. Jace kept the black stallion moving at a punishing gallop, but the flats were becoming treacherous. The wind, which had been a constant companion since they left Red Rock, turned into a physical assault. It screamed across the open ground, tearing up tumbleweeds and hurling them through the air like skeletal debris. Clara buried her face against the rough wool of Jace's duster. The lace of her wedding dress was already heavy with dampness, the hem mud-stained and ruined. She felt the horse stumble, its hoof catching on a hidden badger hole or a knot of roots, and Jace's arm tightened around her waist like an iron band, pulling the animal up and forward with sheer brute strength. "We have to get off the flats," Jace shouted, though his voice was barely audible over the rising gale. "The storm is moving faster than I thought." He hauled on the reins, veering the stallion sharply to the left. They left the beaten trail, such as it was, and plunged into the rugged, broken land that marked the edge of the Badlands. Here, the earth was not a flat platter, but a tortured landscape of dry creek beds, sandstone ridges, and gullies that twisted like scars across the face of the territory. Jace knew this land. He knew it the way a man knows the back of his own hand, or the layout of a graveyard where he has buried too many kin. He navigated the horse down a steep shale incline, the animal sliding on its haunches, hooves scrabbling for purchase on the loose rock. Clara cried out, certain they were going to tumble into the ravine below, but Jace held them steady, balancing their weight with a practiced, unconscious grace. The rain began in earnest then, not as a drizzle but as a deluge. It came down in icy, slashing sheets, cold enough to numb the skin on contact. Lightning forked across the sky, a jagged white vein that illuminated the canyon walls in stark, ghostly relief, followed instantly by a crack of thunder that shook the ground beneath the horse's hooves. "There!" Jace yelled. Through the curtain of rain, Clara saw a dark shape nestled against the side of a limestone bluff. It was a line shack, a relic from the days of the open range before the fences went up. It looked small and pitiful against the sheer scale of the storm. a wooden box slowly losing its war against the elements. Jace pulled the horse up to the front of the shack. He swung his leg over the saddle horn and dropped to the muddy ground, splashing in a puddle that was rapidly becoming a stream. He reached up and grabbed Clara by the waist. She was too frozen and terrified to protest this time. She let him pull her down, her legs buckling as her boots hit the slick earth. "Get inside," Jace ordered, shoving her toward the door. He stayed back to lead the horse into the lee of the building, tying it securely to a support post beneath the overhang of the roof. Clara fumbled with the latch of the shack door. Her fingers were stiff and unresponsive, slippery with rain. Finally, the wood gave way, and the door groaned inward on rusted hinges. She stumbled into the darkness. The interior of the shack was dry, but only just. It smelled of ancient hay, rat droppings, and the lingering ghostly scent of tobacco smoke from cowhands who had moved on or died decades ago. The wind whistled through the gaps in the plank walls, creating a high-pitched keening sound, but the roof, miraculously, held against the deluge. Clara hugged herself, her teeth chattering so violently that her jaw ached. She was soaked to the bone. The wedding dress, which had felt like a costume in the church, now felt like a death trap. The heavy layers of fabric clung to her legs and torso, icy and suffocating. The door banged open again, and Jace ducked inside. He slammed it shut against the wind and through the latch, plunging them into near-total darkness until a flash of lightning through the cracks lit up his face. He was dripping wet, water streaming from the brim of his hat, his duster heavy and black with rain. He took a step toward her, and Clara scrambled backward until her spine hit the rough wood of the wall. "Do not touch me!" she screamed. The fear that had been frozen in her throat during the ride finally thawed into a hot, shaking rage. "You stay away from me!" Jace stopped. He took off his hat and slapped it against his thigh, sending a spray of water across the floor. "Clara," he said, his voice weary but steady, "we are safe for now. The storm will cover our tracks." "Safe?" Clara laughed, a hysterical, jagged sound. "You call this safe? You kidnapped me. You stormed into a church and stole me like I was a sack of feed. You have ruined my life. Jace Holloway, do you understand that? You have ruined everything." She was shaking so hard she could barely stand, but the anger held her upright. "Silas will hunt you down," she spat. "He will bring the law, and he will hang you from the nearest tree, and I will be disgraced forever. Why did you do it? Why could you not just stay dead?" Jace tossed his hat onto a dusty wooden table in the corner. He began to unbutton his duster, his movements jerky with repressed emotion. "I did not stay dead because I had a promise to keep," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "And I did not ruin your life. Clara, I saved it." "You saved nothing," Clara shouted, tears hot against her cold cheeks. "You do not know what you have done. Silas was going to save the ranch. He was going to pay the debts. Now my mother will starve. Ethan will lose the land. And it is all your fault." Jace stripped off the heavy coat and hung it on a nail. Underneath, he wore a simple gray work shirt and a vest, both dark with sweat and rain. He turned to face her, and in the gloom, his eyes were like flint striking steel. "Silas Ward was never going to save your ranch." "Clara," Jace said. He walked toward the small stone fireplace at the end of the room, kneeling down to inspect the stack of dry wood left by the last occupant. "Silas is the reason your ranch is failing." Clara froze. "What are you talking about?" Jace began to arrange the kindling with rough, practiced motions. He pulled a box of lucifer matches from his vest pocket, striking one against the stone hearth. The flame flared up, illuminating the sharp angles of his face. "Who do you think dammed the creek upstream 3 years ago?" Jace asked, feeding the small flame to the dry grass and twigs. "Who do you think hired men to cut your fences in the middle of the night so the cattle would scatter and run off the weight?" That was rustlers," Clara stammered, though a cold knot of doubt began to form in her stomach. "Ethan said it was just bad luck and rustlers." "Ethan is a fool," Jace said, not unkindly, but with brutal honesty. "And Silas owns the rustlers." He has been bleeding your stepfather dry for 5 years, driving down the value of the land so he could snap it up for pennies on the dollar. And the marriage? That was just the final signature on the deed. He gets the land, the water rights, and he gets you as a trophy to put on his shelf. Clara shook her head, water flying from her hair. You are lying. You are just trying to justify what you did. Am I? Jace looked up from the fire, the growing flames casting dancing shadows across the hollows of his cheeks. He looked older than his 24 years. He looked like a man who had seen the bottom of the world. Ask yourself, Clara, Jace said quietly, why did Caleb die? The name hung in the air between them, heavier than the thunder outside. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. It was an accident, she whispered. His horse stepped in a hole. Caleb was the best rider in the county. Jace said, better than me, better than anyone. He could ride a horse blindfolded over broken shale. Jace stood up, wiping his soot-stained hands on his trousers. He walked closer to her, stopping just outside of arm's reach. I found the man who cut his cinch. Clara. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Clara pressed her hands against the wall behind her for support. No, she breathed. No, I found him in a saloon in Abilene 6 months ago. Jace continued, his voice devoid of triumph, filled only with a grim, terrible certainty. He was drunk and bragging about a job he did for a banker in Red Rock. He said the young buck on the Miller place was making too much noise about water rights, so he had to be quieted down. Clara stared at him. She wanted to scream at him to stop, to call him a liar, but the truth of it rang in her bones. She remembered Caleb's saddle, how the strap had been broken cleanly. She remembered how quickly Silas had appeared after the funeral, hat in hand, offering loans that he knew they could never repay. Silas killed him, Jace said. He killed your brother as surely as if he had pulled the trigger himself, and I was not going to let him put his hands on you. I would have burned this whole territory to the ground before I let that happen. Clara's legs finally gave out. She slid down the wall until she hit the floor, burying her face in her hands. The sobs that racked her body were not the polite, stifled cries of a lady. They were the raw, ugly sounds of a heart breaking open. Jace did not move to comfort her. He knew he had no right to touch her. Not yet. He stood there, watching her fall apart, his own hands clenched into fists at his sides. He hated seeing her pain, but he knew the wound had to be cleaned before it could heal. After a long time, the sobbing subsided into shivering silence. The fire crackled in the grate, throwing heat into the small room, but Clara was still shaking uncontrollably. Jace sighed, the sound heavy with fatigue. You need to get dry. Clara. She looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, her hair plastered to her skull. She looked like a drowned ghost. I have nothing to wear, she whispered. Jace began to unbutton his shirt. Clara's eyes went wide, and she scrambled back, pressing herself into the corner. What are you doing? Jace ignored her panic. He stripped off his shirt, revealing a torso that was roped with lean muscle and marked with scars. There was a jagged white line across his ribs, another on his shoulder, the map of a violent life. He held the shirt out to her near the fire to warm it for a second. It was flannel, thick and relatively dry, as his duster had taken the brunt of the storm. Take this, he said, tossing it to her. It will swallow you whole, but it is dry. He turned away from her, walking to the far corner of the shack where a moth-eaten saddle blanket lay on a pile of straw. He picked it up and shook it out, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Change, he commanded, keeping his back to her. Hang that dress by the fire. If you stay in those wet clothes, you will catch pneumonia, and we are 3 days' ride from a doctor. I cannot have you dying on me after I went to all the trouble of stealing you? Clara held the flannel shirt against her chest. It smelled of him, wood smoke, sweat, and the sharp scent of pine. She looked at his broad back. He was standing perfectly still, staring at the dark wood of the door, his posture rigid. She realized, with a jolt of confusing clarity, that he was protecting her modesty. He could have done anything he wanted. They were miles from civilization, in a lawless land, and she was technically his prisoner. but he stood there like a statue, granting her a privacy that the small room did not naturally afford. Trembling, Clara reached for the buttons of her wedding dress. Her fingers were clumsy, but she managed to undo the back. She peeled the wet, heavy silk from her shoulders, the fabric making a wet slapping sound as it hit the floor. She shivered violently as the cold air hit her skin. She stripped off her petticoats, her corset, her stockings, until she was standing naked in the firelight. For a second, shame burned through her, hot and intense. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she had never been in her life. She hurried to pull on Jace's shirt. The flannel was rough against her skin, but it was warm. It hung down to her knees, the sleeves extending inches past her fingertips. She rolled up the cuffs and wrapped her arms around herself. I am done, she said, her voice small. Jace waited a beat, as if ensuring she was truly ready. Before he turned around, he held the saddle blanket in his hand. He did not look at her legs or the way the shirt clung to her frame. He kept his eyes strictly on her face. Come sit by the fire, he said. He spread the blanket on the floor in front of the hearth. Clara hesitated, then moved toward the warmth. She sat down, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping the tail of the shirt around her toes. Jace sat down on the other side of the fire, keeping a respectful distance between them, though in the cramped shack. The distance was only a few feet. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was not the silence of shock, but of exhaustion. The storm raged outside, wind battering the walls, rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof. But inside, the fire popped and hissed, creating a tiny, fragile sphere of light. Clara watched him. The firelight softened the hard planes of his face, making him look more like the boy she remembered. Where have you been? Jace, she asked softly. For 5 years. Where did you go? Jace poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks swirling up the chimney. I went to hell, mostly. He said he leaned back against the wall, stretching his legs out. When the fire took the house, he started, and then stopped. He did not look at her. He looked into the flames. I know you heard about the fire at my family's place, he said. Clara nodded. Everyone knew. It had been the start of the dark times. The Holloway homestead had burned to the ground one dry August night. Jace's father and mother had made it out, but his younger brother, William, had been trapped in the loft. I was in town when it happened. Jace said I was buying grain. I saw the smoke from 10 miles away. By the time I got back, the roof had already caved in. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. I found a kerosene can in the brush about 50 yards out, Jace said. It had the bank's brand stamped on the bottom. Silas did not just want our land. Clara, he wanted to make an example. He wanted to show the county what happens when you refuse to sell to the syndicate. He looked at his hands, turning them over in the light. They were scarred, the knuckles battered. I buried William, Jace said, and then I buried my parents' hope. They moved back east a month later. They were broken, but I stayed. I took a job riding for the Circle T in Montana. I worked 18 hours a day. I saved every dollar. I learned how to shoot faster than the men Silas hired. I learned how to track. And I learned that in this world, the law does not protect you. Only money and lead protect you. He looked at Clara then, his eyes intense. I built my ranch out of nothing. Clara, I took land that no one else wanted, the high desert, the scrubland, and I made it work. I fought off rustlers. I fought off winter. And every time I branded a calf, every time I sold a steer, I put the money away for one thing. To destroy Silas? Clara asked. To come back for you. Jace said. Clara felt her breath hitch. I heard he was circling you. Jace said, I have men in town. They told me about the debts. They told me about the pressure. I was coming. Clara, I was riding south to pay off Ethan's note and ask you to come with me properly, but then I heard about the wedding. He clenched his jaw. I rode 2 horses to death to get there in time. I was not going to let him win. I was not going to let him take the only good thing left in my life. Clara stared at him. The image of the ruthless cattle baron, the monster the town whispered about, began to dissolve. Beneath the scars and the gun belt, He was just a man who had been hurt so badly that he had built a fortress around his heart, leaving the gate open for only one person. She felt a sudden, crushing guilt. While he had been fighting to survive, to come back to her, she had been slowly surrendering. "I was so scared, Jace," she admitted, her voice trembling. "After Caleb died, I just gave up. Ethan was so hard on me. He told me every day that we were going to starve, that it was my fault for being another mouth to feed. When Silas offered the marriage, I felt like I was drowning, and he was the only piece of driftwood in the ocean." She pulled the shirt tighter around herself. "I said yes because I was a coward. I stood there in that church and I let them sell me because I was too weak to fight." "You are not weak," Jace said fiercely. "You are alive. You survived. That is not weakness." A massive crack of thunder exploded directly overhead, shaking the entire shack. Dust drifted down from the ceiling beams. Clara gasped, instinctively flinching away from the noise. She leaned forward, her balance shifting, and for a second she thought she was going to tip over. Jace moved instantly. He reached out and caught her by the shoulders, his hands warm and strong through the thin flannel of the shirt. "Easy," he murmured. "I have got you." Clara looked up. He was close now, very close. The smell of him filled her senses again. But this time it was not frightening. It was anchoring. She looked into his eyes and saw the raw, naked hunger there. It was not the possessive, cold look Silas had given her. This was a fire that matched the one in the hearth, warm, consuming, and dangerous. The air in the shack seemed to thicken. The sound of the rain faded into the background. There was only the heat of his hands on her shoulders and the rapid beating of her own heart. Clara felt a pull in her chest, a physical ache that surprised her. She had spent so long being numb, being dutiful, that she had forgotten what it felt like to want something, to want someone. She leaned in. Just an inch. It was a tiny movement, but it was an answer. Jace's gaze dropped to her lips. His pupils were blown wide, swallowing the gray of his irises. He shifted his grip, one hand sliding up her shoulder to cradle her neck. His thumb brushed her cheek, wiping away a stray droplet of rainwater. His skin was rough, calloused from years of rope and rain, but his touch was incredibly gentle. Clara closed her eyes, her breath hitching. She felt his breath against her face. He was going to kiss her. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted to burn the memory of Silas's cold hands out of her mind with the heat of this man who had ridden through a storm for her. Their lips were a fraction of an inch apart. She could feel the warmth radiating from him. Then he stopped. Jace pulled back. It was a physical effort, like tearing himself away from a lifeline. His hand lingered on her cheek for one agonizing second longer, then fell away. "No," he whispered, his voice rough and strained. Clara opened her eyes, confusion and a sharp pang of rejection stinging her. "Jace?" Jace pushed himself back, retreating to his side of the fire. He ran a hand through his damp hair, his chest heaving as if he had just run a mile. "I cannot," he said, staring at the floor. "Not like this. Not while you are scared and cold and running on adrenaline." He looked at her, and his expression was tortured. "I took you from that church. Clara, I put you in this position. If I touch you now, it is taking advantage. And I will not be that man. I will not be Silas." Clara stared at him, her lips still tingling from the ghost of his proximity. She realized then the depth of the difference between the two men. Silas wanted to own her. Jace wanted her to choose him. "When I touch you," Jace said, his voice low and intense, "it will be because you are free, and because you want me. Clara, not because I am the only one here." He stood up abruptly. "You take the blanket. I will sleep by the door." He grabbed his duster from the nail, rolled it into a makeshift pillow, and lay down across the threshold of the shack, putting the length of the room between them. He turned his back to her, curling onto his side. Clara sat by the fire for a long time, listening to the storm howl outside. She touched her cheek where his thumb had rested. She felt shaken, frustrated, and deeply, confusingly alive. She lay down on the hard floor, pulling the musty blanket up to her chin. She watched the rise and fall of Jace's shoulders in the dim light. She was angry at herself for wanting him, angry at the world for putting them here. But as she listened to his steady breathing, she realized something else. For the first time in 5 years, she was not afraid of the dark. The man by the door was a killer, a kidnapper, and a reputed outlaw. But he was also the only man she had ever known who had looked at her and seen a person, not a possession. Clara closed her eyes, the sound of the rain finally lulling her into a restless sleep, while Jace Holloway kept watch over the door, his hand resting near his gun, his eyes wide open in the dark. The dawn did not arrive with hope. It arrived like a bruise healing on the skin of the sky. The heavy storm clouds from the night before had broken apart, leaving behind a pale, washed-out gray horizon that seemed to stretch on for eternity. The air was frigid, biting at exposed skin with the damp, lingering chill of the heavy rains. Inside the line shack, the fire had burned down to a pile of sullen red coals. Clara woke with a start, her neck stiff and her body aching from the unforgiving hardness of the wooden floor. For a moment, disoriented by the strange shadows and the smell of damp wool, she forgot where she was. She reached out instinctively for the familiar softness of her own bed quilt, but her hand met rough, scratchy horse blanket instead. Then the memory of the church rushed back, the crashing doors, the gunshots, the terrifying ride through the wind. She sat up sharply, clutching the blanket to her chest. Jace was already awake. He stood by the open door, silhouetted against the bleak morning light. He had put his duster back on, though it was still damp and heavy, and he was checking the cinch on the black stallion just outside. The horse stamped a hoof in the mud, blowing steam from its nostrils. "We have to move," Jace said without turning around. He knew she was awake. He had likely been listening to the change in her breathing. "The creeks will be rising by midday. If we do not cross the wash now, we will be trapped on this side for another 2 days." Clara scrambled to her feet, her joints popping. She was still wearing his oversized flannel shirt. The cuffs rolled up past her wrists, and her legs were bare beneath the hem that hit her at the knees. Her wedding dress hung by the fireplace, a ruined ghost of white lace and mud-stained silk. She looked at the dress, then out at the endless, empty prairie. A heavy, suffocating weight settled in her stomach. It was the weight of finality. Yesterday, she had been Clara Miller, a respectable woman about to make a sacrifice for her family. Today, she was something else entirely. In the eyes of Red Rock, in the eyes of her mother and Ethan, she was ruined, stolen property. A woman who had spent the night in a shack with a notorious cattle baron. "I cannot go back," she whispered, the realization tasting like ash in her mouth. "No," Jace said. He turned then, stepping back inside to grab his saddlebags. "Not today, and likely not ever, if Silas has his way." He tossed a piece of hardtack and a strip of dried beef onto the table. "Eat. It is not much, but it will keep you in the saddle." Clara ignored the food. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of cold and anger. "You said you were saving me, Jace, but it feels a lot like you have just dragged me from one prison to another." "I am taking you to the Double Bar," Jace said, referring to his ranch. "It is 3 hours north of here, deep in the breaks. It is the only place Silas's men will think twice about riding into without an army." "And then what?" Clara asked, wrapping her arms around herself. "Do I just live there? Do I hide in your attic while the whole territory hunts us?" Jace stopped packing the bag. He looked at her, his expression hard, but his eyes betraying that same flicker of exhaustion she had seen the night before. "I am going to finish what I started. Clara, I am going to gather the proof I need to hang Silas Ward. I have names, I have dates, I have the location of the man who doctored the land deeds. But I need time to put it all together in a way that a judge cannot ignore. Until then, you are staying with me." Clara felt a surge of resentment. He spoke with such certainty, moving her around the chessboard of his revenge war without asking if she wanted to be a pawn. "You decided all of this without asking me," she said bitterly. "You stormed in, threw me over your shoulder, and decided my future. Did it ever occur to you that maybe I would have preferred the misery I knew to the danger you have brought down on me?" Jace walked over to her. He loomed large in the small space, smelling of wet leather and rain. You would not have survived him. Clara, he said quietly, Silas breaks things. He breaks horses. He breaks men. And he would have broken you just to see if he could put you back together. I made a decision. Yes, and I will live with the consequences. But I will not apologize for keeping you alive. He reached past her and pulled the wedding dress off the hook. He bundled it up, careless of the delicate fabric. Put this on, he said, shoving the bundle into her arms. It is going to be a cold ride. Clara dressed in silence, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. The dress felt different now. Yesterday it had been a costume of duty. Now it was just a rag, stiff with mud and stained with the reality of her flight. When she walked out into the cold morning air, she felt like a ghost of the girl who had walked into the church. Jace lifted her onto the stallion again. There was no gentleness in the motion, only efficiency. He mounted behind her, his arms caging her in once more, and turned the horse north, away from the town, away from the law, and into the wild country. The landscape changed as they rode. The flat, rolling plains of the southern grazing lands gave way to rougher, more hostile terrain. This was the country Jace had claimed for his own, a land of low, jagged hills topped with scrub oak and cedar, cut through by deep, dry gullies that could hide a rider until he was 10 feet away. The earth here was red and stony, resisting the plow, fit only for cattle that were half wild and tough enough to fight wolves for their dinner. The sun climbed higher, a pale white disk behind the thinning clouds, offering little warmth. The wind blew steadily, drying the mud on Clara's dress until it crusted and flaked away. As they crested a ridge, Jace pulled the horse to a halt. He pointed a gloved hand toward the valley floor below. Look, he said. Clara squinted against the wind, down in the draw. Near a stand of cottonwood trees that marked a spring, stood the blackened skeleton of a house. The chimney rose up like a broken finger, surrounded by the charred remains of walls. The fields around it were overgrown with weeds and sagebrush, reclaiming the furrows where a plow had once turned the earth. That was the Henderson place, Jace said, his voice flat. They were good people. Came out here in '78. They refused to sell their water rights to the syndicate. Clara stared at the ruins. She remembered Mrs. Henderson. She had been a kind woman who sold butter in town on Saturdays. What happened? Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Silas's men said it was a cooking fire gone wrong, Jace said. But a cooking fire does not start in the barn and the house at the same time. The sheriff ruled it an accident. The Hendersons moved on. What was left of them? Silas bought the deed at auction for $10. He spurred the horse forward, guiding them down a treacherous switchback trail. You will see a dozen more like that before we reach my gate. Jace said, this is how he built his empire. Clara, not with business, but with matches and kerosene, he clears the board, and the town looks the other way because his bank holds the mortgage on the church and the general store. Clara remained silent as they passed 2 more abandoned dugouts and a burned wagon left to rot in a dry creek bed. The evidence was undeniable. She had lived in Red Rock her whole life, shielded by her stepfather's desperate attempts to remain neutral, and she had never truly looked at the emptiness of the land. She had believed the stories of bad luck and hard winters. Now, seeing the pattern through Jace's eyes, the landscape looked less like a frontier and more like a graveyard. By the time they reached the double bar, the sun was high and the air had warmed slightly. Jace's ranch was not the sprawling, manicured estate that Silas owned near town. It was a fortress disguised as a working ranch. The main house was a low, squat structure built of heavy logs and stone, designed to withstand blizzards and bullets alike. A bunkhouse, a large barn, and several corrals were clustered nearby, all built with the same grim practicality. As they rode into the yard, activity ground to a halt. 3 men were repairing a wagon wheel near the barn. They straightened up, tools hanging in their hands, staring at the black stallion and its double burden. A dog barked, a sharp, warning sound, until a whistle from the porch silenced it. Jace reined the horse in near the hitching post. A man stepped off the porch of the bunkhouse. He was older, with a face like tanned leather and a mustache that drooped past his chin. He walked with a limp, favoring his left leg. This was Gus, Jace's foreman. Clara remembered him from years ago. He had been a drift rider who had taught Jace how to rope. "Boss," Gus said, his eyes flicking from Jace to Clara and back again. "We were wondering if you were coming back upright or draped over the saddle." "I am upright." "Gus," Jace said, sliding down from the horse. He reached up and helped Clara down. Her legs were so stiff she nearly collapsed, but she grabbed the hitching rail to steady herself. The other men were whispering now, low murmurs that carried on the wind. Clara felt their eyes on her, the ruined bride, the white dress stark and ridiculous against the mud and manure of the ranch yard. She saw curiosity, yes, but also wariness. To these men, she was not a guest. She was a target painted on their backs. "This is Clara," Jace announced loudly enough for the yard to hear. "She is staying." Gus took off his hat, revealing a stark white tan line on his forehead. He looked at Clara with a mixture of pity and grave concern. "Ma'am," Gus said, nodding respectfully. "You are a long way from a church out here." "I know," Clara said, her voice sounding thin in the open air. "Silas will have men in the saddle by now," Jace told Gus. Ignoring the pleasantries, "Put lookouts on the North Ridge and the East Canyon. If anyone rides within a mile of the perimeter, I want to know about it. And tell the boys to keep their rifles close." "It is that bad?" Gus asked quietly. "I took her from the altar." "Gus," Jace said, uncinching the saddle, "it is worse than that." Gus let out a low whistle. "Well, that explains the dress. I will get the boys moving." Jace turned to Clara. "Come inside." He led her into the main house. It was dark and cool inside, contrasting sharply with the bright sun. The main room was large, dominated by a massive stone fireplace. The furniture was simple, made of pine and leather, built for comfort and use, not for show. There were no velvet drapes, no crystal vases. It smelled of wood smoke, gun oil, and coffee. Jace led her down a short hallway and opened a door. "You can sleep here," he said. The room was small. It contained a narrow iron bed covered with a faded patchwork quilt, a washstand with a chipped pitcher, and a wooden chair. The floorboards were swept clean but bare. "It is not what you are used to," Jace said, leaning against the doorframe. Clara walked in and touched the quilt. The fabric was soft, worn thin by years of use. It felt real. Silas's house was full of stiff brocade and cold marble, things that were afraid of dust. This room felt like it had been lived in. "It is fine," Clara said softly. "I will find you something to wear," Jace said. "One of the boys is small. He might have a spare pair of trousers and a shirt that will fit better than mine. Burn the dress. Clara, it is no good to you here." He closed the door, leaving her alone. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. The silence of the house settled around her. She took a deep breath, expecting to feel panic, but instead, she felt a strange hollow settling in her chest. She was a fugitive. She was a scandal. But for the first time in months, the knot of dread that had lived in her stomach every time Silas touched her hand was gone. Over the next 3 days, the ranch absorbed her. She did not hide in the room. Clara was not a woman who could sit idle while others worked. The morning after they arrived, she walked into the kitchen, tied a flour sack around her waist as an apron, and took over the cooking from a startled Gus, who had been burning biscuits for 20 years. She wore the borrowed clothes, a pair of wool trousers that she had to belt tightly at the waist and a calico shirt that had seen better days. She braided her hair back severely, stripping away the softness of the town girl. She peeled potatoes by the bushel. She scrubbed the grime from the pine table. She folded the rough laundry that smelled of lye soap and wind. Slowly, the rhythm of the ranch began to seep into her bones. It was a brutal, relentless rhythm. Up before dawn to break the ice on the water troughs, branding calves in the dust and heat of the afternoon, mending fence lines that the wind tore down every week. She watched Jace from the kitchen window or the porch, He worked harder than any of his men. There was no arrogance in his labor. He did not sit on a horse and point. He was down in the mud, wrestling steers, swinging a hammer, his shirt soaked with sweat. She saw the way the men looked at him, not with the fear they showed Silas, but with the quiet respect men give to a leader who bleeds the same color they do. But the outside world could not be kept at bay by fences. On the fourth day, a rider came through, a circuit preacher named Reverend Thomas, a man with a dusty coat and a Bible saddlebag, who rode from ranch to ranch bringing news and judgment in equal measure. He stopped for water, but when he saw Clara hanging sheets on the line, his face went rigid. He did not tip his hat. He did not smile. He spoke to Gus near the barn, his voice carrying on the wind. "They are calling her a Jezebel in town," the preacher said, his tone dripping with sanctimony. "They say she conspired with him, that she is living in sin. No decent woman will speak her name. Gus, you are harboring a fallen woman and a kidnapper." Gus had spit on the ground and told the preacher to water his horse and move on, but the words had landed. Clara stood frozen behind the damp sheet, her face burning. Fallen woman. The label was heavy. A stone hung around her neck. She saw the way some of the younger ranch hands looked at her now, not with hostility, but with a knowing, speculative look that made her skin crawl. She also noticed the silence from the neighbors. Usually, on the range, neighbors stopped by to swap news or borrow tools. But the road to the double bar remained empty. The fear of Silas Ward had created a quarantine zone around them. That evening, the weight of it all nearly crushed her. She sat on the porch as the sun went down, peeling apples for a pie. She thought of her mother. Was she crying? Or was she listening to Ethan rage about the lost land deal? Clara felt a wave of nausea. She had traded her family's safety for her own freedom. Was that not the definition of selfishness? But then she looked up. Jace was walking across the yard from the barn. He stopped to adjust a gate latch, his movements efficient and sure. He looked up and caught her eye. He did not smile, but he nodded, a simple acknowledgement of her presence. In that moment, the guilt warred with a dangerous lightness. No one here told her when to speak. No one told her how to dress. No one touched her with cold, possessive hands. She was an outcast, yes, but she was breathing air that felt entirely her own. Later that night, unable to sleep, Clara wandered out toward the corrals. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, providing just enough light to see outlines. She found Jace leaning against the rails of the breaking pen. Inside, a young sorrel mare was pacing nervously, her coat slick with sweat, eyes rolling white in the darkness. She was a wild thing, brought in from the high country, terrified of the rope and the fence. Jace was speaking to her. "Easy, girl," he murmured. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the hardness he used with the men. "You are all right. I am not going to hurt you. You are just fighting the fear. That is all. It is just fear." Clara stood by the fence, entranced. She had never seen this side of him. The town knew Jace Holloway the gunman, the ruthless baron. They did not know this man with the patient hands and the voice like calm water. Jace reached out a hand. Slowly, the mare snorted and backed away, trembling. Jace did not retreat, but he did not push. He waited. He stood perfectly still, offering his presence as a grounding point in her chaos. "It takes time to trust the hand when you have only known the whip," Jace said softly, not taking his eyes off the horse. Clara realized he knew she was there. "She is beautiful," Clara said, stepping up to the rail beside him. "She is hurt," Jace corrected. "Someone took a rope to her before she ran wild. She remembers the pain more than she remembers the freedom." The mare took a hesitant step forward, stretching her neck out to sniff Jace's palm. Jace let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. He stroked her velvet nose, his thumb tracing the white star on her forehead. As the horse settled, lowering her head, Jace's shoulders sagged. The tension that held him upright seemed to drain away, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. He leaned his forehead against the wooden rail, closing his eyes for a second. Clara saw it then, the weight he was carrying, the the ghosts of his brother, the pressure of the impending fight, the responsibility for her life. He was one man standing against a hurricane. She reached out. It was an impulsive motion, born of a sudden, fierce desire to share that weight. She placed her hand on his forearm, feeling the rigid muscle beneath the cotton sleeve. "Thank you," she whispered. Jace opened his eyes and turned his head to look at her. His face was inches from hers. The moonlight caught the jagged line of the scar on his jaw. "For what?" he asked hoarsely. "For making you a pariah. For coming for me." Clara said, "I hated you for it on the ride. I was so afraid. But seeing you here, seeing what you built, I know why you did it. And I know you did not do it to own me." Jace turned fully toward her. The horse moved away, forgotten. The air between them tightened, charged with the same electricity that had been in the line shack, but deeper now. Grounded in the dust and the reality of their situation, "I would have torn the church down brick by brick." Clara, his voice low and intensely quiet. He looked at her mouth, then up to her eyes. The longing on his face was raw, stripping away her defenses. Clara felt a pull in her chest so strong it frightened her. She wanted him to cross the distance. She wanted to know if the fire she sensed in him could burn away the cold memories of Silas. Jace lifted his hand, but instead of pulling her into an embrace, he took her hand, the one resting on his arm, in his own. His grip was warm, rough, and incredibly gentle. He lifted her hand to his lips. He pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. It was a gesture of reverence, of worship. It was not the kiss of a conqueror, but of a man pledging his sword and his soul. The sensation of his lips on her skin sent a shock wave through Clara. Her breath hitched. She stepped closer, her body swaying toward him. Jace lowered her hand slowly, his thumb brushing over her pulse point. He looked like he was about to speak, about to break his own rule about waiting. "Boss!" The shout shattered the moment like glass. Jace spun around, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip instantly. Clara gasped. Stepping back, Gus came running from the bunkhouse, a lantern swinging in his hand. "Boss, we have a rider coming in hot from the South Ridge. It is young Billy." Jace's face hardened, the mask slamming back into place. The tender man at the corral was gone. The cattle baron was back. "What is it?" Jace barked as the young rider galloped into the yard. His horse lathered and blowing hard. The boy slid off the saddle, dusting his hat against his leg. "Bad news, Mr. Holloway," the boy panted. "I was in town getting supplies. Silas has put up posters." "Posters?" Jace asked. "A bounty," the boy said, swallowing hard. "He has put $1,000 on your head, dead or alive. He is calling it kidnapping and attempted murder, and he has deputized a posse. 20 men, boss. They are riding the range right now, asking questions at every homestead between here and the river." Silence descended on the yard. $1,000 was a fortune. It was enough money to turn a loyal neighbor into a Judas. It was enough to buy a lot of bullets. Jace looked at Gus. "Double the guard. No one sleeps tonight. If you see dust, you shoot to warn. Then you shoot to kill." He turned back to Clara. The moonlight cast deep shadows over his eyes, making him look dangerous again. "Go inside. Clara," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "Stay away from the windows." "But Jace—" Clara started. "Go!" he shouted, the fear for her safety turning his voice into a whip crack. Clara turned and ran toward the house, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached the door and looked back. Jace was standing in the center of the yard, checking the cylinder of his revolver. Surrounded by the night and the encroaching enemy, she realized then, with terrifying clarity, that the wedding was just the prologue. The war had officially begun, and simply by standing in this yard, by wearing his shirt and eating his bread, she had chosen her side. She was part of the fight now, and there would be no mercy for either of them. The noose around the double-bar ranch tightened slowly, loop by agonizing loop. It did not begin with a frontal assault, but with a series of quiet, malignant cruelties that wore down the nerves of every man and animal on the property. It started with the watchers. Clara would see them in the early mornings. silhouettes cut from black paper against the rising sun on the distant ridges. They sat motionless on their horses, rifles resting across their saddles, simply watching. They were too far to identify, but close enough to send a message. We are here, and there is nowhere you can go that we do not see. Then came the cuts. Fences that had been checked at dusk were found severed at dawn. The wire curled back like a dead snake, allowing 30 head of cattle to wander into the labyrinth of the canyons. The ranch hands spent days riding the brakes, hazing the spooked animals back, cursing the invisible enemy. But the turning point, the moment the war shifted from harassment to something darker, happened on a Tuesday. Clara was in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread, when Gus slammed the back door open. His face, usually stoic, was twisted in a grimace of pure fury. "Do not let the dogs out," Gus ordered, his voice tight. "And do not go near the south pasture trough. What is it?" Clara wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, her heart instantly hammering a warning rhythm against her ribs. Jace walked in behind him. He looked like a man carved from granite. His eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth she had seen by the corral days ago. "They poisoned the water," Jace said flatly. "Arsenic. We found 2 calves dead beside it. If the wind had not shifted and carried the smell to the rest of the herd, we would have lost 50 head by noon." Clara put a hand to her mouth. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Poisoning water in the West was not just a crime, it was a sin against the land itself. It was a violation of the unwritten code that governed survival in a place where thirst killed faster than bullets. "Silas?" Clara whispered. Jace walked to the window, staring out at the empty horizon. "He is done playing games with deeds and paper," he said. "He wants to starve us out or kill us off. He does not care which." The security at the ranch became a suffocating blanket. Jace stopped sleeping. He spent his nights in the saddle, riding the perimeter with a Winchester rifle scabbarded under his leg. Clara would lie awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the window panes. Every time a coyote howled, she flinched. Every time the dogs barked, she imagined the dark shape of a torchbearer creeping toward the house. The guilt was a constant, gnawing companion. She knew Jace was riding out there in the dark because of her. She knew the calves were dead because of her. If she had simply said, "I do," and signed the papers, Jace would still be a free man, safe on his own land. Her freedom had been bought with his peace, and the price was rising every day. "We are running low on coffee and flour," Gus announced one morning. 3 weeks into the siege, and we are out of rivets to fix the tack. We cannot run a ranch without supplies. "Boss?" Jace nodded, scraping the remains of his breakfast beans from his tin plate. "I will go to town. It is a trap," Clara said instantly, dropping the dish rag she was holding. "You know it is a trap. You cannot ride into Red Rock alone. I will take Gus and 2 of the boys," Jace said, standing up and buckling his gun belt. "But we cannot hide here forever. Clara, if we stop living, he wins." The trip to town was a gauntlet. Jace rode at the head of his small column, his eyes scanning every alley and rooftop. The town of Red Rock, usually bustling with midweek commerce, seemed to hold its breath as they passed. People stopped on the boardwalks to stare. Mothers pulled their children behind their skirts. The blacksmith stopped hammering. They tied their horses at the general store. Jace walked in, his spurs ringing on the floorboards, and bought what he needed with gold coin, ignoring the nervous stutter of the shopkeeper. It was when they stepped back out into the street that the trap sprung. It was not an ambush of bullets, but of words. Silas Ward stood in the middle of the dusty street, flanked by the sheriff and the town council. He was dressed in a pristine gray suit, a stark contrast to Jace's dust-coated duster. "Holloway!" Silas called out, his voice booming with the practiced projection of a man used to commanding boardrooms. Jace stopped on the bottom step of the store porch. He did not move his hand to his gun, but his stance shifted, weight balanced on the balls of his feet. "I have no business with you, Ward," Jace said. "But I have business with you," Silas said, smiling that thin, cold smile. He turned slightly, addressing the crowd that had gathered on the porches and in the windows. "I am a forgiving man," Silas announced, The whole town knows how I have been wronged. My bride was stolen, my wedding desecrated by a criminal." He looked back at Jace, his eyes glittering with malice. "You tell Clara that I bear her no ill will," Silas said. "Tell her that if she returns to me, if she renounces you and admits she was confused and frightened by your violence, I will take her back. I will restore her reputation. She will be Mrs. Ward, and she will be safe." He let the offer hang in the air, sweet and poisonous. "But," Silas continued, his voice dropping an octave, "if she stays with you, Holloway, then she chooses her own destruction. I will not be responsible for what happens to a woman who willingly beds down with an outlaw." The crowd murmured. Jace could see the judgment in their eyes. They wanted the story to end. They wanted the scandal to be tidied up. If Clara returned, order would be restored. If she stayed, she was a whore, and whatever happened to her was her own fault. Jace stepped down into the dirt street. He walked until he was 10 paces from Silas. "She is not a thing to be returned." "Ward," Jace said, his voice low and dangerous. "She is a woman who made a choice, and she would rather die free on my land than live as a prisoner in your house." Silas's smile vanished. "Then she will die," he whispered, loud enough only for Jace to hear. "And you will watch it happen." Jace returned to the ranch with the supplies, but the news of the encounter traveled faster than his horses. One of the ranch hands, a young man who had been courting a girl in town, heard the gossip and brought it to the bunkhouse. Clara heard it from Gus later that evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun bleed out over the horizon. "He offered to take me back?" Clara asked, her voice hollow. "He did," Gus said, rolling a cigarette with stained fingers, like he was offering to take back a stray dog that had bit him. Said he was forgiving. Clara felt a crack run through her chest. It was not heartbreak. It was the shattering of the last illusions she held about her place in the world, to the town, to the people she had grown up with. She was not Clara. She was a symbol. She was a damaged asset. If she went back, she would be the repentant wife, saved by the benevolent patriarch. If she stayed, she was a fallen woman, deserving of starvation and violence. There was no third option. There was no version of the story where she was just a woman who loved a man. The unfairness of it burned her throat like bile. She looked out at the darkening prairie, and for the first time, she did not feel fear. She felt a cold, hard resolve settling in her gut, heavy as lead. "I am not going back," Clara said softly. Gus lit his cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the twilight. "Good," he said, "because we would miss your biscuits." The spring turned into summer, and with the heat came the drought. It was a merciless, grinding dryness that turned the soil to powder and the grass to straw. The wind, usually a nuisance, became a convection oven, sucking the moisture out of everything it touched. The creek that fed the double bar began to fail. It slowed to a trickle, then to a series of muddy pools that smelled of stagnation. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing through their dusty hides. They stood listlessly in the shade of the cottonwoods, too weak to forage. Jace watched the sky every day, searching for clouds that never came. "We have to move them," he told Clara one evening in July. The heat lay on the ranch like a physical weight. They were standing in the barn, the air thick with the smell of dry hay and horse sweat. "Move them where?" Clara asked. She was wiping down a saddle, her hands rougher now, her nails short and broken. "West," Jace said. "There are high springs in the Sweetwater Basin. It is a 3-day drive through the Badlands. If I leave them here, they will be dead in a week." "But that takes you away from the house," Clara said, looking up sharply. "That leaves the ranch open." "I know," Jace said. He ran a hand through his hair, leaving a streak of dust on his forehead. "It is a gamble. But if I lose the herd, I lose the ranch anyway. I cannot fight Silas with empty pockets." He stepped closer to her. "I am leaving Gus and 3 men here. They will guard the house. You are not to leave the yard. Clara, do you understand?" "Not for anything." Clara nodded. "I understand." She looked at him. He was thinner, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. He had been fighting this war for months without a break. She saw the worry etched into the lines around his mouth. Worry for the cattle, for the land, but mostly for her. The air in the barn shifted. The dust motes dancing in the shaft of evening light seemed to slow down. The tension that had been simmering between them since the night in the line shack flared up, hot and undeniable. "Jace," Clara whispered. He looked at her, and the control he wore like armor cracked. He took a step forward, invading her space. He reached out and placed his hand on the back of her neck. His palm was calloused, hot and rough, but his touch sent a shiver racing down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. Clara dropped the rag she was holding. Her hands came up, fisting into the fabric of his shirt. She pulled him toward her, rising onto her toes. They stood there, breaths mingling, bodies radiating heat. It was a question asked and answered in silence. The desire was overwhelming, a desperate need to find something soft in a world of sharp edges. Jace lowered his head. His lips brushed her forehead, her temple, hovering just above her mouth. Clara closed her eyes, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might bruise her ribs. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted him to take her, right there against the rough wood of the stall door, to prove that they were still alive. But Jace pulled back. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "Not yet," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. "Not while I am walking out the door. If I start this, Clara, I will not be able to leave, and I have to leave." He pulled away from her, his hands sliding down her arms before letting go. "When I come back," Jace said, looking at her with a fierce intensity. "When the herd is safe and Silas is dealt with, we will decide what this is, together, not under his shadow." He turned and walked out of the barn, striding toward his horse without looking back. Clara stood in the silence, her skin burning where he had touched her, listening to the sound of hooves fading into the dusk. 2 days later, the sun set behind a veil of red dust. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence hanging over the ranch. Clara was in the kitchen, washing the supper dishes. Gus was on the front porch, cleaning his rifle. 2 other hands, slim and red, were playing cards in the bunkhouse. The attack did not begin with a shout. It began with a crack. A gunshot shattered the evening calm, echoing off the barn walls. Clara dropped a ceramic plate. It smashed on the floor, but the sound was lost in the sudden eruption of chaos. Gus shouted something from the porch, followed immediately by the boom of his buffalo rifle. Clara ran to the window. Outside, the yard was descending into hell. Riders were pouring over the ridge to the east, their faces covered with bandanas. Guns blazing. Muzzle flashes sparked like fireflies in the gathering gloom. "Get down!" Gus roared from outside. "Clara, get on the floor!" Clara dropped to her knees, crawling toward the hallway. Another shot blew out the kitchen window, showering her with glass. She covered her head, her ears ringing. Then she smelled it. Smoke. She looked up to see an orange glow flickering through the broken window. The bunkhouse. They had thrown torches. "Fire!" she screamed, though no one could hear her. She scrambled to the back door, staying low. She had to help. Slim and Red were in there. She pushed the door open and ran into the yard, crouching behind the water trough. The heat hit her instantly. The dry timber of the bunkhouse had caught like kindling. Flames were licking up the walls, illuminating the yard in a terrifying, erratic light. Slim stumbled out of the burning building, coughing, his shirt smoking. He had his gun in his hand, firing blindly into the dark. "Slim, look out!" Clara screamed. A rider thundered past. Leaning low, a pistol cracked. Slim jerked backward as if kicked by a mule. He fell into the dust and did not move. "No!" Clara cried. She grabbed a bucket from beside the trough. It was heavy, sloshing with water, but adrenaline gave her strength she did not know she possessed. She ran toward the main house, dousing the porch where a stray ember had landed. Bullets whined past her like angry hornets. She was sobbing, choking on the acrid smoke, but she kept moving. Everything Jace had built, the house, the barn, the life he had carved out of this rock, was being erased in front of her eyes. We are overrun, Gus yelled, limping toward her from the corner of the house. He was bleeding from a graze on his cheek. Get inside, girl! They are circling for the kill! Suddenly, a new sound cut through the roar of the fire and the guns. It was the thunder of hooves, but not from the attackers. It was coming from the west. A single rider burst into the firelight, driving his horse straight through the heart of the chaos. It was Jace. He had sensed the trap. He had seen the tracks, or felt the shift in the wind. Or maybe he just knew Silas Ward's black soul too well. He had left the herd and ridden back, killing his horse to get there. He did not stop. He rode straight at the nearest attacker, his reins in his teeth, a Colt revolver in each hand. He opened fire, a blur of motion and vengeance. Two of the attackers scrambled to turn their horses, surprised by the sudden fury in their midst. One man fell from his saddle. "Jace!" Clara screamed, relief and terror warring in her chest. Jace's horse collided with another rider, sending both animals staggering. Jace leapt from the saddle before his horse went down, rolling in the dirt and coming up firing. He took cover behind a wagon wheel, pinning down 3 men who were trying to flank the house. "Gus, cover the left!" Jace roared. He was drawing their fire, making himself the target to buy his men time to regroup. Bullets kicked up dirt all around him. He was trapped. Clara saw it from the porch. She saw a man in a long coat detach himself from the shadows of the burning bunkhouse. He was creeping along the fence line, moving to a spot where he would have a clear shot at Jace's exposed back. Jace did not see him. He was focused on the riders in front of him. Clara looked around wildly. Gus was reloading. Red was pinned down near the barn. There was no one else. Clara turned and ran back into the house. She scrambled up the stairs, her breath coming in sobbing gasps. She burst into Jace's bedroom and grabbed the spare Winchester rifle he kept by the wardrobe. It was heavy. It smelled of oil and cold steel. She ran to the window that overlooked the yard. Her hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped the weapon. She smashed the glass with the barrel of the rifle and rested it on the sill. Below, the yard was a nightmare of fire and shadow. She found Jace behind the wagon. Then she found the man in the long coat. He had stopped. He was raising his rifle, taking aim at the back of Jace's head. Clara pulled the stock of the Winchester against her shoulder. She remembered what her brother Caleb had taught her years ago. Breath out, squeeze, do not pull. She looked down the sights. The man's back filled the V-notch. She did not think about sin. She did not think about being a lady. She thought about Jace dying in the dirt. Clara squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard, slamming into her shoulder with bruising force. The boom was deafening in the small room. Below, the man in the long coat crumpled. He did not cry out. He simply folded forward and hit the ground. Jace spun around at the sound of the shot from the house. He saw the dead man behind him. He looked up at the window. For a split second, their eyes met across the distance. Him in the dirt, surrounded by fire. Her in the window, holding a smoking rifle. The tide turned. The attackers, realizing they had lost the element of surprise and were now taking effective fire from the house, lost their nerve. A whistle blew, sharp and piercing. "Pull back!" someone shouted. The remaining riders turned their horses and galloped into the darkness, leaving the burning bunkhouse and their dead behind. Silence returned to the double bar, but it was not peaceful. It was the heavy, ringing silence of aftermath. The bunkhouse was a total loss. The roof had collapsed, sending a plume of sparks into the night sky. The men spent hours throwing dirt and water on the ruins to keep the fire from spreading to the barn. When dawn finally broke, it revealed a scene of desolation. The yard was churned into mud and ash. They found Slim's body near the trough. They covered him with a tarp. Jace stood over him, his hat in his hand. His face was gray with soot and grief. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. Clara stood on the porch, watching him. Her shoulder throbbed where the rifle had kicked her. She felt numb. She had killed a man. She knew she should feel horror, but all she felt was a cold, pragmatic relief. Jace was alive, She walked down the steps and crossed the yard. She stopped beside Jace. He did not look at her. "I should have been here," he said, his voice raspy from smoke. "I should never have left. You came back," Clara said softly. "Slim is dead," Jace said, "because of me, because he worked for me, because of Silas." Clara corrected him firmly. "Do not take his sins. Jace, you have enough of your own." Jace looked at her then. He looked at the bruise forming on her shoulder where her dress was torn. He looked at the soot on her face. "You shot him," Jace said. "The man by the fence." "I did," Clara said. Jace closed his eyes for a moment. "I wanted to keep you from this. Clara, I wanted to keep your hands clean. My hands have not been clean since I climbed on your horse." Clara said, "I live here. Jace, this is my fight too." That night, the main house felt like a tomb. The air was thick with the smell of smoke that drifted in from the ruined bunkhouse. Clara found Jace in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table, a bowl of water and a rag in front of him. He had stripped off his shirt. There was a bloody graze on his upper arm where a bullet had passed too close. His hands were shaking so badly he could not wring out the cloth. Clara walked over to him. She did not say a word. She took the cloth from his hands. Jace went still. Clara dipped the rag in the water and gently wiped the blood from his arm. The wound was shallow, but it was angry and red against his skin. She cleaned it with steady, careful strokes. She could feel the tension radiating off him, the heat of his body warming the cool air of the kitchen. She finished cleaning the wound and tossed the rag into the bowl. The water turned pink. She looked at his face. He was staring at her with an expression of such raw, unguarded need that it stole the breath from her lungs. The adrenaline of the battle had faded, leaving behind a stark, terrifying clarity. They were alive. They were together. And death was waiting just outside the door. Jace stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Clara," he warned, his voice breaking. Clara stepped in close. She did not care about the future. She did not care about the town or the scandal or the danger. She needed to feel him. She laid her hands on his bare chest, over his heart. It was beating wildly. She leaned into him, burying her face in the crook of his neck. He smelled of smoke and sweat and life. Jace let out a sound that was half groan, half sob. His arms came around her, crushing her to him. One hand tangled in her hair, pulling her head back. He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce, desperate, tasting of salt and desperation. It was a collision of two people who had just looked into the abyss and survived. Clara opened to him, meeting his intensity with her own. Her fingers dug into his shoulders, anchoring him to her. Jace walked her backward until her back hit the wall. He pressed his body against hers, his hips hard against her softness. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the friction of skin on skin, the taste of his mouth, the overwhelming, consuming heat of him. Clara's hands moved to the waistband of his trousers. She wanted to be closer. She wanted to erase the distance completely. Jace shuddered. He tore his mouth away from hers, gasping for air. He pressed his forehead against hers. His eyes squeezed shut. "Stop," he rasped. "Clara, stop." Clara froze, her chest heaving. "Why?" she whispered. "We are alive. Jace, why do we have to wait?" Jace gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging in. "Because I will not take you like this," he said, his voice shaking with the effort of restraint. "I will not take you in a house that smells of smoke, with a dead man in the yard and a gun in my hand." He opened his eyes. They were dark with pain and love. "You deserve better than a desperate tumble in the dark. Clara, when I love you, and I do love you, it is going to be because we have won. It is going to be the start of a life, not a comfort against death." Clara looked at him, frustration aching in her belly. But beneath it, a profound swell of respect. He was protecting her, even from himself. He was holding out for a future he wasn't sure they would have, simply because he believed she was worth it. She reached up and touched his face. "You promise?" she asked softly. "I promise," Jace said. He kissed her forehead, a lingering, solemn seal on the vow. Then he stepped back, putting space between them before his resolve could crumble. Go to sleep. Clara, he said gently. Tomorrow. We finish this. Clara watched him walk out to the porch to take the first watch. She touched her lips, which were swollen and bruised, and knew that he was right. They had survived the fire. Now, they had to survive the war. The smoke from the ruins of the bunkhouse hung low over the double bar for 3 days, a gray shroud that refused to lift. It was a physical reminder of the cost of their survival. They buried Slim on a rise overlooking the creek, in a grave dug from earth as hard as iron. There were no prayers spoken, for the preacher had made his allegiance clear, so Gus simply took off his hat and said that Slim was a good hand who sat a horse well. It was the highest praise a man could get in the territory. The attack had drawn a line in the sand, sharp and bloody. The isolation of the ranch deepened, but the nature of it changed. The neighboring ranchers, men who had known Jace for years, now looked at the smoke rising in the distance and had to make a choice. For many, fear was the only master they recognized. The owners of the Bar K, the folks at the Lazy J, they turned their backs completely. When Jace's men rode the fence lines, those neighbors looked the other way, refusing to acknowledge the wave of a hand. They were terrified of Silas Ward, of his money, and of the hired guns who now patrolled the county roads like wolves. But not everyone was cowed. 2 nights after the attack, a wagon appeared at the main gate under the cover of a moonless sky. It was driven by Elias Thorne, a quiet man who farmed a patch of rocky soil 5 miles to the east. He did not come to the house. He simply unloaded 4 sacks of flour, a crate of ammunition, and a bag of coffee by the gate post, then turned his mules around and vanished into the dark. The next morning, Gus found a fresh horse tied to the south fence, a sturdy bay with good legs, left by a widow whose husband had been run off by the syndicate 2 years prior. There was no note, just the animal, a silent offering to the war effort. These small gestures of defiance did not change the odds, but they changed the air in the ranch house. They were proof that Silas's grip was slipping, that beneath the fear, there was a simmering resentment waiting for a spark. Inside the main house, Jace was done waiting. He called Clara into the small room he used as an office. It was a sparse space, dominated by a heavy oak desk covered in maps and ledgers. The shutters were drawn tight, blocking out the sun, leaving the room in a permanent, dusty twilight illuminated by a kerosene lamp. "Sit down, Clara," Jace said. His voice was rough. He had not slept in 30 hours. Clara sat in the wooden chair opposite him. She watched as he unlocked the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a battered tin box. He set it on the desk between them. It looked innocuous, a box meant for tobacco or letters. But the way Jace handled it suggested it contained dynamite. "I told you I was gathering proof," Jace said. "I told you I had names and dates, but I never showed you the whole of it because I wanted to spare you." "Spare me?" Clara asked, a flash of irritation cutting through her fatigue. "After the fire? After shooting a man?" "I think we are past sparing." Jace nodded slowly. "You are right." He opened the box. It was filled with papers, some yellowed with age, others crisp and new. There were land deeds, handwritten affidavits, and scraps of ledger paper torn from books. "Silas is not just a banker," Jace said, spreading the papers out. "He is the head of a land trust called the Western Development Company. It sounds official, but it is a shell. He uses it to buy distressed properties." Clara looked at the papers. She saw familiar names, the Hendersons, the Millers. "He creates the distress," Clara said, her voice flat. Jace tapped a piece of paper. "This is a sworn statement from a man named Drunkard in Abilene, the one I told you about. He admits to being paid $50 to poison the Hendersons' well. And this," he pointed to a ledger page, "this is a payout record from Silas's private book. It lists payments to the sheriff, to the land assessor, and to a man named Vickers." "Who is Vickers?" Clara asked. "Vickers is a specialist," Jace said grimly. "He specializes in accidents." Jace reached into the box and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. He held it for a moment, his thumb rubbing the edge, before sliding it across the desk to Clara. "Read the date," he said softly. Clara picked it up. It was a receipt for a wire transfer of $200 to Thomas Vickers. The date was October 12th, 1884. The world seemed to stop spinning. The room went silent, save for the hiss of the lamp. October 12th, Clara whispered. That was the day Caleb died. She remembered it with the clarity of a nightmare. The sky had been a brilliant, cloudless blue. Caleb had ridden out to check the herd near the canyon. He had been laughing at breakfast, teasing her about a ribbon she was wearing. By noon, his horse had come back with an empty saddle. By 2 o'clock, they had found him at the bottom of the ravine, his neck broken. Everyone had said it was a tragedy. A loose cinch, a spooked horse. Just bad luck. Jace watched her face. Caleb refused to sign the water rights over to the trust 3 days before he died. He said, "Ethan told me Caleb threw Silas off the porch. Silas does not forgive humiliation. Clara, and he does not accept no for an answer." Clara stared at the receipt. The ink was faded, but the numbers were clear. $200. That was the price of her brother's life. That was the cost of her family's ruin. The grief that washed over her was not the weeping, hysterical grief of the funeral. It was cold. It was hard. It felt like a stone settling in the pit of her stomach. She thought of Ethan, beaten down and terrified, forcing her to marry the man who had ordered her brother's murder. She thought of her mother, fading away in the shadows of a house she no longer owned. And she thought of Silas, standing at the altar, holding her hand with the same fingers that had signed this transfer. "He killed him," Clara said. Her voice did not shake. It was as steady as a judge's gavel. "Yes," Jace said. "And he was going to kill me," Clara continued. "Not with a gun, but by burying me alive in his house, by making me smile at him across the dinner table every night, knowing he owned me." She looked up at Jace. Her eyes were dry and terrifyingly bright. "I am done hiding. Jace, we have the evidence," Jace said. "But a judge in this county is likely bought. If we take this to the circuit court—" "No," Clara interrupted. She stood up, the chair scraping back. "We take it to the town. We take it to the people who look at me and see a whore. We take it to the men who are too scared to look you in the eye." She slammed her hand down on the papers. "I want to go back. Jace, I want to go to Red Rock." Jace stood up too. "It is suicide. Clara, he has 20 gunmen in that town. If we ride in there, we might not ride out." "I do not care," Clara said. "I am not going to live in this house waiting for the next fire. I am not going to let him tell my story. If I am going to be ruined, then I am going to be the kind of ruin that brings the whole house down." She looked at him, and for the first time, she looked like a partner in his war, not a prize to be protected. "Take me to town. Jace, take me to the town hall. I am going to tell them the truth. And if they kill us, then at least we die on our feet." Jace looked at her for a long moment. He saw the iron in her spine, the same iron that had made him fall in love with her by the fence line years ago. He nodded once. "Get your coat," he said. "We ride at dawn." The dawn was raw and bleeding. The wind cut across the plains like a razor, carrying the grit of the drought. Jace and Clara rode side by side, flanked by Gus and the 2 remaining ranch hands. They were a small, grim procession, heavily armed and silent. Clara rode the mare Jace had given her. She wore her trousers and a heavy coat, her hair braided back tight. She did not look like a bride. She looked like a soldier. As the buildings of Red Rock rose from the dust, Clara felt a tremor in her hands. She clamped them harder around the reins. She would not let them see her shake. They rode down Main Street. It was mid-morning, and the town was awake. As the sound of their hooves echoed off the wooden storefronts, people stopped, heads turned, doors opened. The silence that followed them was heavy and judging. Clara could hear the whispers. They hissed like snakes in the dry grass. Look at her, wearing men's clothes, shameless, living in sin, fallen woman. Clara kept her chin lifted. She looked straight ahead, focusing on the steps of the town hall at the end of the street. She felt the eyes of the women she had grown up with, women who had once praised her embroidery and her modesty. Now they looked at her with a mixture of disgust and fascination, as if she were a circus freak. They reached the town hall, a sturdy brick building that doubled as the courthouse. There were horses tied out front, dozens of them, Silas's men. Jace reined in his stallion. He looked at Gus. "Watch the horses," Jace said. "If this goes bad, bring them to the side door. We will be ready." "Boss," Gus said, sliding his rifle from its scabbard. Jace dismounted and reached up for Clara. She ignored his hand and swung down herself, her boots hitting the dirt with a solid thud. She adjusted her coat, took a deep breath of the cold air, and walked up the steps. Jace fell in beside her, his hand resting near his gun. Inside, the hall was packed. It seemed the whole town had squeezed into the room, sensing the climax of the drama that had gripped them for months. The air was hot and smelled of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and tension. At the front of the room, behind a heavy table, sat the town mayor and the sheriff. But the man truly in charge was sitting in a high-backed chair to the right, legs crossed, looking relaxed and imperious. Silas Ward. When Jace and Clara pushed through the doors, the room erupted. Shouts, jeers, and gasps filled the air. The sheriff stood up, banging his gavel uselessly against the table. "Order! Order!" Silas did not stand. He just watched them come down the center aisle, his eyes cold and dead as shark eyes. Jace stopped 10 feet from the table. He stood with his feet apart. His duster swept back to clear his holster. Clara stood next to him, feeling small but rigid. "So," Silas said, his voice cutting through the noise, "the prodigal daughter returns, and she has brought her abductor with her." "I was not abducted," Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but it silenced the room. Silas chuckled, a dry, patronizing sound. "Of course you think that, my dear. Stockholm Syndrome is a powerful thing. We know what this man is. We know what he has done to your mind." He stood up then, buttoning his jacket, assuming the role of the benevolent patriarch. "Clara," he said, holding out a hand. "Step away from him. Come here. We can end this right now. The town knows you are a victim. We are ready to forgive your indiscretions. Just come here, and we will see that Mr. Holloway is dealt with by the law." Clara looked at his hand. It was manicured, clean, soft. It was the hand that had signed the death warrant for her brother. "I am not a victim," Clara said, her voice rising. "And I am not looking for forgiveness from a murderer." The crowd gasped. A ripple of shock went through the room. Silas's smile faltered. "You are hysterical," he said sharply. "Sheriff, arrest Mr. Holloway. He has clearly turned this poor girl's mind." "No!" Clara shouted. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the packet of papers. She slammed them onto the mayor's table. "Look at them," she demanded, turning to face the crowd. "Look at the truth." She pointed at Silas. "You think he is a businessman? He is a thief. He hired men to burn the Henderson place. He paid the rustlers who stole the cattle from the Barquet." "Lies!" Silas shouted, his face reddening. "The ramblings of a ruined woman." Clara took a step toward the crowd. She saw faces she knew. Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Gable, Old Man Miller. "You all know what has been happening," Clara cried, her voice shaking with the force of her adrenaline. "You have all lost cattle. You have all seen the fires. You think it is bad luck? It is him." She swung back to Silas. "But that wasn't enough, was it? You wanted the water rights to my stepfather's land, and when my brother Caleb said no, you had him killed." A hush fell over the room. The mention of Caleb's name struck a nerve. Everyone had liked Caleb. "I have the receipt," Clara said, tears stinging her eyes but not falling. "Signed by you. $200 to Thomas Vickers, the man who cut his saddle cinch." She looked at Ethan, her stepfather, who was sitting in the front row, his face pale as a sheet. "He killed Caleb." "Ethan," Clara said, her voice breaking. "He killed your son, and then he offered to buy your debts to cover his tracks. And you sold me to him." Ethan stood up. his mouth opening and closing. Is that true?" he stammered, looking at Silas. Silas's composure cracked. "This is absurd," he roared. "These are forgeries. This man Holloway is a criminal. He stormed a church. He is a gunman." A voice spoke up from the back of the room. "A woman's voice. I saw the men who burned my barn. Mrs." Gable said. She stood up. A small, gray-haired woman in a faded bonnet. They rode horses with the bank's brand. I was too scared to say it, but I saw them. Another man stood up, a rancher from the valley. I was offered money to cut the fences at the double bar, he admitted, looking at the floor. By the sheriff. The room began to turn. The murmurs grew into a roar. The fear that Silas had cultivated for years was cracking under the weight of the truth. People were looking at Silas not with respect, but with dawning horror. Silas saw it happening. He saw his empire crumbling in the eyes of the people he despised. He looked at Clara, and the mask of the gentleman fell away completely, revealing the monster underneath. "You ungrateful slut!" Silas spat. The words rang out like a gunshot. He pointed a shaking finger at her. "You are nothing. You are a whore who ran off with a murderer. You are dirt. Clara Miller. Dirt!" The insult hung in the air, vicious and ugly. Clara flinched as if he had struck her. For a second, the shame threatened to swallow her. The word whore echoed in her mind, validating every fear she had harbored since she rode away from the church. Then, Jace moved. He stepped in front of Clara, placing himself between her and Silas. He did not draw his gun, but his presence was more threatening than any weapon. He was vibrating with a cold, lethal rage. "You will not speak to her," Jace said. His voice was quiet, but it carried to the back of the hall. He took a step toward Silas. "You will not look at her, and you will never, as long as you draw breath, name her like that again." "She is mine!" Silas screamed. "Losing all control. I bought her. I paid for her. I am not property." Clara shouted from behind Jace. Silas reached into his jacket. "Gun!" someone screamed. The room exploded. Silas pulled a small, silver-plated pistol from his pocket, but before he could level it, Jace drew. The motion was a blur. Bang! Jace's shot took Silas in the shoulder, spinning him around. Silas dropped his gun, screaming in pain. At the same moment, the sheriff drew his weapon, aiming at Jace. Bang! Gus, who had slipped in the side door, fired from the back of the room. The sheriff's hat flew off, and he dove behind the table. "Get them!" Silas shrieked, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "Kill them all!" Silas's hired men scattered through the room, drew their weapons. But the town had had enough. "No more," Ethan shouted. He grabbed the arm of a gunman near him. A brawl erupted. It was chaos. Ranchers tackled hired guns. Chairs were smashed. Gunshots rang out, shattering windows and sending plaster raining down from the ceiling. Jace grabbed Clara by the coat. "Stay down." He shoved her behind the heavy oak table as a bullet chipped the wood inches from his head. He returned fire, his shots precise and controlled, forcing the gunman near the door to take cover. Silas, seeing the tide turn against him, seeing his own hired men being beaten back by the angry mob, scrambled to his feet. He looked wild, his eyes wide with panic. He grabbed his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. He saw the back door of the hall standing open. "He ran! He is running!" Clara yelled, pointing. Jace vaulted over the table. He did not look back. He sprinted after Silas, bursting out the back door into the alley. Clara scrambled to her feet. The hall was a melee of fighting men, but her eyes were fixed on the open door. She was not going to stay behind. Not this time. This was her story, and she was going to see the end of it. She ran after them. Outside, the wind was howling. Silas was running down the alley, stumbling, heading toward the only sanctuary he could think of, the church. He was heading back to where it all began. Jace was 20 paces behind him, gun drawn, moving with the relentless determination of a wolf. Clara ran, her heart hammering in her throat, her boots pounding the dirt. The white steeple of the church loomed ahead, stark against the gray sky. It looked like a judgment. It looked like the mouth of an old wound waiting to be closed. Silas crashed through the church doors. Jace followed, and Clara, breathless and terrified, but fueled by a rage that burned brighter than any fire, ran into the darkness after them. The interior of the church was not a sanctuary. It was a tomb of shadows. The air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of beeswax candles that had long since burned down to nubs and the lingering, metallic tang of the gun smoke that had drifted in from the street. Silas Ward stood behind the altar railing, his back to the large wooden cross. His face was a mask of sweat and terror, his eyes darting frantically in the gloom. He had one arm wrapped tightly around the neck of Reverend Miller, using the thin, trembling preacher as a human shield. In his other hand, he held a revolver, the barrel pressed hard against the Reverend's temple, when the heavy double doors creaked open, admitting a slice of the gray, wind-scoured light from the outside. Silas shrieked, "Stay back! Do not come in here! I will kill him! I swear to God I will send him to his maker!" Jace stepped into the nave first, his boots making no sound on the floorboards. He held his Colt low, his body angled, presenting a narrow target. Clara slipped in behind him, the breath catching in her throat. The sight of the church made her dizzy. It was the same long aisle she had walked down months ago, the same rough-hewn pews, the same warped floorboard near the front. It felt as if time had folded in on itself, trapping her in a nightmare loop. But the last time she had stood here, she had been a victim, paralyzed by duty and dread. Today, she walked in with dirt on her face, a rifle bruise on her shoulder, and a fire in her blood. "Silas," Jace called out. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the hysterical raving coming from the altar. "It is over. The town has seen the papers. They know about the fires. They know about Caleb." "Lies!" Silas screamed, saliva flying from his lips. He dragged the whimpering Reverend back a step, knocking over a brass candlestick. Clang! The sound echoed violently in the empty space. "They owe me!" Silas shouted, his voice cracking. "I built this town. I funded the bank. I paid for the roof over this ungrateful preacher's head. I own every mortgage and every deed in this valley. You cannot touch me. I am the law here. You are the law," Jace corrected him, taking a slow step forward. "Now you are just a man with a gun and no friends left to hold it for him." Silas's eyes locked onto Jace, burning with a mixture of hatred and fear. Then, his gaze flickered past Jace's shoulder. He saw Clara. The recognition twisted his face into a sneer so vile it made Clara's stomach turn. "And there she is," Silas spat, "the whore of Babylon. Look at you, dressed like a man, filthy. You let him ruin you. Clara, I offered you a palace, and you chose the dirt." Clara stepped out from behind Jace. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her legs were steady. She walked until she was standing in the middle of the aisle, the place where the bride usually stops. "You did not offer me a palace, Silas," she said. Her voice was not loud, but in the acoustic stillness of the church, it carried with the force of a bell. "You offered me a cage. I bought you," Silas raved, the gun wavering slightly as he gestured. "I paid your father's debts. I saved your family. You belong to me. He stole you." He pointed the gun at Jace, then back to the Reverend, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "He stole my property." Clara took another step. The wood creaked under her boot. "He did not steal me," she said, her voice rising, shaking off the last vestiges of the girl she used to be. "I went with him, and I am not property. I am not a deed you can lock in a safe." She looked him in the eye, seeing him for the first time not as a monster, but as a small, pathetic man who thought money could buy loyalty and fear could buy love. "You never owned me, Silas," Clara declared, the words tearing out of her throat. "You only ever owned my fear, and I am not afraid of you anymore." The silence that followed was absolute. The truth of her words hung in the air, stripping Silas of his power. He blinked, stunned by her defiance. For a fraction of a second, his focus fractured. He looked from Jace to Clara, his mind unable to comprehend that the terrified girl he had tried to marry was gone. In that split second of confusion, the gun barrel drifted away from the Reverend's head. Jace saw it. He tensed to fire, but Clara was closer. She did not think, she did not plan. She lunged. She covered the last 3 feet in a rush of motion, vaulting up the single step to the altar. Silas tried to bring the gun back around, his eyes going wide with shock. Clara swung her arm, putting every ounce of her anger, her grief for Caleb, and her fight for survival into the blow. Her forearm slammed into Silas's wrist. The gun went off. Bang! The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet went wild, missing Jace by inches and slamming into the stained glass window high above the altar. The glass shattered, raining down a shower of red and blue shards that tinkled like wind chimes as they hit the floor. Silas screamed in rage and shoved Clara backward. She stumbled, falling hard against the communion rail. Jace was on him before he could fire again. Jace hit Silas like a freight train, driving his shoulder into the banker's midsection. They crashed to the floor, rolling in the dust and the broken glass. Silas was fighting with the desperation of a drowning man, scratching, biting, trying to bring the gun to bear. Clara scrambled to her feet. She saw the gun skittering across the floorboards. "Get the gun!" Jace shouted, gritting his teeth as he wrestled Silas's arm down. Clara dove for the weapon. She grabbed the cold steel barrel and slid it backward, out of reach. Silas roared, landing a punch on Jace's jaw. Jace's head snapped back, but he did not let go. He pinned Silas's wrists to the floor, his weight pressing the older man into the dust. "Stay down," Jace snarled. Silas bucked, screaming obscenities, frothing at the mouth. Suddenly, the church doors banged open again. Sheriff Miller, Ethan, and a dozen men from the town burst in. They stopped, staring at the scene, the shattered window, the cowering preacher, Clara holding the gun, and the cattle baron pinning the banker to the floor of the house of God. "Get him off me!" Silas shrieked when he saw the sheriff. "Arrest him! He tried to kill me! I am Silas Ward! I command you to arrest him!" The sheriff walked down the aisle. He looked at Clara. He saw the bruise on her face, the gun in her hand, and the fierce, unyielding look in her eyes. Then he looked at Silas, writhing on the floor, stripped of his dignity. The sheriff holstered his own weapon. He reached down, grabbed Silas by the collar of his ruined suit, and hauled him to his feet. "You are under arrest, Silas," the sheriff said heavily. Silas stared at him, his mouth hanging open. "What? You cannot arrest me. I own you." "Not anymore," the sheriff said. He pulled a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. "We heard the testimony. We saw the papers Clara brought, and Mrs. Gable told us about the men she saw at the Henderson place. It is over." Silas began to struggle, but 2 other men, townspeople who had lived in fear of him for years, stepped forward and grabbed his arms. They held him fast, their grip not gentle. Jay stood up. He wiped blood from his lip with the back of his hand. He looked at Clara. She was trembling now that the adrenaline was fading, but she was standing tall. Jace took the gun from her hand gently. He unloaded the cylinder, dropping the bullets into his pocket, and handed the empty weapon to the sheriff. Silas was dragged out of the church, screaming threats of lawsuits and vengeance all the way to the door. "I will ruin you all," Silas howled. "You will beg me for mercy." The doors slammed shut, cutting off his voice. The silence returned to the church, but the air felt different. The heaviness was gone. The dust motes dancing in the light from the broken window seemed to swirl with a new freedom. Ethan, Clara's stepfather, stood near the front pew. He looked old and shrunken. He looked at Clara, then at the floor. He did not speak. He could not. The shame of what he had almost done, of what he had allowed to happen, was a weight he would carry to his grave. Clara did not wait for his apology. She turned to Jace. "Is it done?" she whispered. Jace looked at the closed doors. "The snake has lost his fangs," he said. "It is done. Outside, the wind had scrubbed the sky clean. It was a brilliant, hard blue, the kind of sky that only exists in the west after a storm." A crowd had gathered in the street to watch Silas being marched to the jailhouse. He was shouting, kicking, a man unraveling in public view. The facade of the respectable businessman was gone, leaving only the tyrant. When Clara and Jace emerged from the church, the crowd went quiet. They stood on the steps, blinking in the bright sunlight. Clara felt the eyes of the town on her. She waited for the insults. She waited for the slurs, but no one spoke. Mrs. Gable, the widow who had spoken up in the hall, nodded to Clara. It was a small gesture, stiff and brief, but it was an acknowledgement. A young woman near the back of the crowd, someone Clara had gone to school with, looked at her with wide, awed eyes. There were still hard looks. The preacher's wife pursed her lips and turned away, clutching her shawl. To some, Clara would always be the woman who ran off, the woman who brought violence to the town. But the universal condemnation was broken. She was not a hero. She was not a villain. She was simply a woman who had survived. However, the law was a rigid machine, and it did not turn on sentiment alone. The sheriff came back from the jailhouse. He walked up the steps, his face grim. "Jace," the sheriff said. "I cannot just let you ride away." Jace nodded. "I know. You stormed a church." The sheriff listed, ticking points off on his fingers. "You discharged a firearm in the town limits. You took a woman against the will of her legal guardian at the time, and you shot a man today. Even if he was a criminal." Jace did not argue. "I will pay what is owed. It is going to be more than money," the sheriff warned. "There is talk of a trial in the district court. The judge might want jail time." Clara stepped forward. "Then you will have to jail me too," she said. The sheriff sighed. "Clara, I went with him," Clara said, raising her voice so the lingering crowd could hear. "I testified in that hall, and I am testifying now. I went of my own free will once I knew the truth. He protected me. If he is a criminal for saving my life, then I am a criminal for letting him." She looked at the sheriff. "You let Silas Ward run this town like a prison for 5 years. You let him kill my brother. If you put Jace in a cell after he did the job you were too scared to do, then there is no law in Red Rock worth respecting." The sheriff looked at her, then at the murmuring crowd. He saw the way the wind was blowing. He knew that if he arrested Jace Holloway today, he might have a riot on his hands. "Fine," the sheriff grunted. "I will speak to the judge, but there will be fines, heavy ones, and the syndicate lawyers will likely contest your claim to the southern grazing lands. You might lose half your ranch." "Holloway, I do not care about the land," Jace said, looking at Clara. "Let them have the dirt. I have what matters." A compromise was hammered out in the sheriff's office as the sun began to lower. Jace agreed to pay a fine of $5,000, a crippling sum that would take nearly all his savings. He agreed to cede the disputed water rights on the southern border to the town trust, and he was given a stern warning that if he ever drew a gun in Red Rock again, he would hang. It was not a victory, it was a survival. By the time they walked out of the sheriff's office, it was night. The town was quiet, the excitement of the day having faded into the exhaustion of the aftermath. They walked back to the church to retrieve their horses. The street was empty, bathed in the silver light of the moon. They stopped by the hitching post. The church loomed above them, silent and dark. The broken window gaped like a missing tooth. The wind picked up, tugging at Clara's coat and whipping loose strands of hair across her face. She shivered, not from cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that it was over. The running, the fighting, the fear. Jace stood by his stallion, his hand resting on the saddle horn. He did not mount. He looked at Clara. He looked tired. The events of the last few months had carved deep lines into his face, but his eyes were clear. "Clara," he said softly. "Yes?" "Silas is gone," Jace said. "The threat is gone. Ethan." "I saw the way he looked at you. He knows he was wrong. He would take you back. You could reclaim the Miller homestead, with Silas's debts voided by the fraud. The land is yours again." Clara frowned. "What are you saying?" "I am saying you have a choice," Jace said. "A real choice. Not one made at gunpoint or out of desperation. You can go home. You can be a respectable woman again. You can wash your hands of the scandal and of me." He looked down at his boots. "I am a marked man. Clara, I lost half my land today. I have enemies living with me. It will never be easy. It will be hard work and cold winters and people whispering when we ride into town." He looked up, his expression guarded, preparing himself for the blow. "I would not blame you if you wanted peace." Clara stared at him. She thought of the homestead. She thought of the quiet, safe life she could have. She could rebuild the farm. She could marry a shopkeeper one day. She could be safe. She stepped close to him. She could smell the dust on his coat and the scent of the man beneath it. "Jace," she said. She reached out and laid her hand on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it beating, steady, strong, alive. "I am tired of being respectable," she said, "and I am tired of letting fear decide my fate." She looked up into his eyes. "You told me once that you would build something that no one could take away. Well, you did. You built this, us." She moved her hand up to cup his jaw, her thumb tracing the line of the scar. "I do not want safe. Jace, I do not want easy. I want the man who rode through a storm for me. I want the man who stood in front of a bullet for me. I choose you." Jace let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. The guard came down. The walls crumbled. "Clara," he whispered. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against him. He buried his face in her hair, holding her as if he was afraid she might vanish if he let go. Then he lifted his head and kissed her. It was not like the kiss in the kitchen, desperate and frantic. And it was not like the kiss at the corral, reverent and restrained. This kiss was deep, unhurried, and absolute. It was a claiming and a surrender all at once. It tasted of the cold wind and the warm blood of survival. It was a promise made not in words, but in breath and touch. It was the sealing of a bond that had been forged in fire. Clara melted into him, wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. For the first time in her life, she felt completely, terrifyingly free. Weeks later, the snow came. They had ridden out to the valley Jace had spoken of, a remote fold in the earth to the west, far from the prying eyes of Red Rock. It was a hard place. The grass was stubborn, the wind was relentless, and the creek was a thin ribbon of silver that fought its way through the stones. They built a house. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs and mud, with a roof that leaked until they learned to patch it right. They worked from dawn until dusk. Clara's hands grew calloused. Her skin turned brown from the sun and wind. She learned to shoot a rifle as well as any hand. And she learned to ride the range, checking the small herd they had managed to salvage. They faced prejudice when they rode to the trading post for supplies. Some folks turned their backs, but they also found friends, outcasts and drifters who judged a person by the work they did, not the rumors they heard. The story ends on a winter evening in late December. The wind was clawing at the walls of the cabin, a high-pitched shriek that sounded like 1,000 ghosts trying to get in. Snow was piled high against the door, and the temperature outside had dropped to 20 below. But inside, the fire was burning. The cabin was small, filled with the golden light of the hearth. It smelled of pine resin, stew, and drying wool. Jace and Clara lay together on a rug in front of the fire, covered by the worn patchwork quilt from the ranch house. They were wrapped around each other, limbs tangled, seeking warmth and closeness. They were tired. Their bodies ached from a day spent chopping wood and breaking ice on the creek. But it was a good tired, the kind of tired that comes from building something that belongs to you. "Do you think the spring melt will flood the lower pasture?" Clara asked softly, her head resting on Jace's chest. "Maybe," Jace rumbled, his arm tightening around her. "We will have to move the fence line up the ridge next week." Clara traced a pattern on his shirt with her finger. "And the calf crop?" Jace kissed the top of her head. "The bull is strong. We will have calves in March. It will be a good year." "Clara, hard, but good." Clara closed her eyes. She listened to the wind howling outside. She thought of the vast, indifferent prairie stretching out in all directions, miles of snow and darkness. It was a harsh world. It was a world that did not care if they lived or died. But in this little circle of light, the indifference of the world did not matter. She shifted, pressing closer to him. She felt his heart beating against her back. She felt the warmth of his skin, I love you. Jace, she whispered. I love you. Clara, he answered. Outside, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that drifted up to the indifferent stars. But inside the rough-built home, their love burned like a stubborn flame, born from tragedy, sharpened by loss, and strong enough to keep the dark at bay for as long as they both chose to tend it. Thank you so much for journeying with me through the storm, the fire, and the open plains of this Wild West love story. It has been an honor to bring Clara and Jace's fight for freedom and love to life for you. I would love to hear your thoughts on their journey. Please leave a comment below sharing where you are listening from and what you thought of the ending. Did Clara make the right choice? If you enjoyed this tale of the American frontier, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of outlaws, romance, and survival under the big sky. Until we ride again.